I never thought life could be so ironic. It was just another ordinary night at the small restaurant where I work. Customers came and went, dishes were served, and muffled conversations filled the room while I tried to keep up with the pace behind the counter. Until he walked in. The sound of the door opening caught my attention, and there he was, the man who once promised me the world, Marcos. He was wearing an impeccable suit, the kind that made everyone around him look like amateurs, and at his side was a stunning, young, confident woman with a smile that seemed to light up the room. My heart sank as if it were being squeezed by an invisible hand. For an instant, time froze. Our eyes met, and in that moment, all the years I had spent trying to forget our history came flooding back. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure, but it was as if every fiber of my being was being tested. He didn't belong here, a simple, cozy restaurant, but far from the sophisticated circuits he used to frequent. With a lump in my throat but a firm voice, I greeted him. "Good evening, welcome." He hesitated for a moment before answering. There wasn't the same confidence in his gaze that I remembered so well, just something I couldn't decipher. "Thank you," he finally replied, his voice so familiar that it brought back a wave of memories I'd rather keep buried. As I led them to a table near the window where the city's glow illuminated the room, I couldn't help but wonder, what is he doing here? The restaurant was known for its home-cooked food, the kind of place that attracts people looking for something real, something that touches the heart. Maybe it was just that, a passing curiosity. But for me, this was much more than just dinner. It was the past staring me in the face. Reopening wounds that I thought had already healed. After seating them, I returned to the counter. My fingers trembled slightly as I pretended to arrange the cutlery and glasses that were already perfectly organized. Every now and then, my eyes would wander towards their table. He seemed so at ease, laughing and talking to his wife, but there was something in his posture that only someone who knew him so intimately could notice. A subtle, almost imperceptible discomfort. I didn't know why he was there, but I knew that that night would be hard to forget. And fate, as always, seemed determined to test me. As I occupied myself at the counter, my mind wandered, dragging me back to moments that I struggled to forget. In the beginning, Marcos and I were a couple full of dreams. He had immense ambition, but also a generous heart, full of promises. I believed that we were building something together, that we were an invincible team. But over time, the shine of that promise faded. His company grew, and along with it, the distance between us grew. He became someone obsessed with work, always chasing something bigger, while I was pushed to the corners of our lives. I remember the endless nights spent alone at home, waiting for him, only to hear the hollow echo of the door closing as he walked upstairs, talking on the phone. At first, I tried to understand. I thought it was a phase, that success required sacrifices, and that we would soon find balance. But balance never came. He began to treat me as if I were just another piece in the puzzle of the perfect life he was building. And when I tried to talk to him, when I begged him to stop and look at me, he simply laughed. "You have everything, Clara. Why are you complaining?" he said, his voice thick with disbelief. That sentence was the final blow. He didn't understand. Maybe he didn't even want to understand. What I needed wasn't money or fancy parties or friends who talked about status as if it were the only thing that mattered. What I needed was him, his presence, his partnership. And right there, in that moment, I realized that I was alone, even though I was his wife. And so I made the hardest decision of my life. I packed my things and left home. I asked for nothing. No alimony, no division of assets. To him, this was inconceivable. "You're giving up everything?" he asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't do it without me." But deep down, I knew it was the only way to save myself. Starting from scratch wasn't easy. I worked menial jobs, struggled to pay the bills, and faced the silent judgment of those who didn't understand why I had left a perfect life. But little by little, I was rediscovering myself. Each small achievement was proof that I could move on. And now, years later, there he was, flawless as ever, but so far removed from the life I had rebuilt. As I struggled to stay focused on work, I couldn't help but let the memories wash over me, invaded one by one. It was as if fate was determined to make me confront everything I had buried. But there was one thing he didn't know yet, a secret I carried alone, a part of me he had never known. And as he chatted animatedly with the woman beside him, a part of me knew that this truth would change everything. The night went on, but it seemed like time in the restaurant moved differently for me. As I waited on other customers, took orders, and arranged silverware, my gaze kept drifting to his table. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the weight of an unresolved story, a presence that seemed to fill the room even without saying a word. When it was time to take their order, I felt butterflies in my stomach. I carefully picked up the tray and walked toward the table, keeping my head high and trying to ignore the lump that seemed to grow in my throat with every step. "Here's your order," I announced, my voice firm. I carefully placed the plates on the table, avoiding looking directly at Marcos, but he didn't give me that choice. His eyes were fixed on me, intense, as if trying to figure out something he didn't understand. "Clara," he murmured, low enough so that the woman next to him couldn't hear. My name leaving his lips was like a punch. For a moment, the world seemed to disappear, and all that was left was the sound of my heart beating wildly. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to ignore the familiarity in his voice. "Sir, is there anything else?" I asked, my professional expression hiding the turmoil happening inside me. He hesitated as if he was about to say something important, but before he could answer, the woman next to him intervened with a polite smile. "No, we're fine, thank you." There was something in the way she held his arm, something possessive that didn't go unnoticed. I nodded and turned, returning to the counter, but my hands were shaking slightly. I tried to find refuge in routine. I organized silverware, I cleaned glasses that were already clean, but nothing seemed capable of taking my heart away from that table. Throughout the night, I noticed that Marcos would occasionally glance in my direction. It wasn't something obvious, but it was enough to keep me alert. There was a subtle uneasiness in his gestures, something that only someone who knew him deeply could notice. He wasn't as comfortable as he seemed to want to show. When they finally asked for the bill, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. As he walked towards the door, something inside me knew that this encounter wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face. As soon as the door closed behind him, the silence in the restaurant seemed even heavier. I took a deep breath, trying to regain control, but fate seemed determined not to leave me alone. What was he doing there, in that place? And why, even after everything, did he still have the power to make me question everything I thought I had already overcome? As I cleaned the tables at the end of my shift, a wave of memories hit me. I remembered everything I had gone through to rebuild myself, every tear, every lonely night, and every small victory that had proven to me that I could move on. But his presence that night seemed to unearth something I was not prepared to face. And then a thought occurred to me, as clear and inevitable as it was painful. He doesn't know about the baby. This secret was mine alone. And I knew that if Marcos found out, everything would change. The following days passed in a blur. Despite all my determination to move on, the encounter with Marcos seemed to have left an invisible mark. Every corner of the restaurant, every dish I served, brought back flashes of that intense look he had given me. It was as if his presence was still there, haunting my space. That afternoon, as I was setting the tables, Rafael, the restaurant manager, and my closest friend, noticed my distraction. He was one of the few people who knew part of my history with Marcos, even though I had never mentioned the baby. "Clara, is everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed as he adjusted his silverware on the counter. "Okay, it's just been a rough week," I replied, looking away, trying to dispel any hint of how I really felt. Rafael knew when not to insist, but I could feel his worried gaze on me as I walked away. Little did I know that this apparent calm would be shattered faster than I imagined. At the end of the shift, as I was closing the restaurant, I heard the doorbell ring. My heart froze before I even turned around. When I looked up, there he was, Marcos. But this time, he was alone. He walked slowly toward me, each step seeming to weigh more than the last. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes were more hunched over, his posture less confident. There was something different about him, a vulnerability I hadn't expected. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, his voice calm but urgent. I forced myself to remain calm. What could he possibly want right now? "I'm busy, Marcos," I said curtly, trying to walk past him, but he blocked my path, his eyes fixed on mine. "I know," he said, his voice lower, almost a whisper. "I know the baby is mine." The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the sound of my heart beating wildly. "What?" I managed to mumble, more like an automatic reaction than a genuine question. "You think I wouldn't notice?" he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I connected the dots, Clara. I know you, and Rafael." He didn't say anything directly, but he let enough slip. My mind whirled, trying to process what he was saying. Rafael. He had connected the dots because of something he had seen, something he had sensed. My chest filled with anger and frustration. You had no right to meddle in my life, Marcos. My voice shook, but I kept my tone steady. This baby is mine, and I don't need you. He took a step back, surprised by the intensity of my words, but he didn't back down completely. Clara, please, I'm not here to take anything from you. I just want to be here. For the baby, there was something in his eyes that seemed sincere, but I couldn't just ignore the past. Everything he had done, all the times he had left me alone when I needed him most, were still fresh in my memory. Do you think you can just show up now, after everything, and be a part of my life again? I asked, crossing my arms. It doesn't work that way, Marcos. He nodded slowly, as if he knew I was right, but refused to give up. I know I messed up, Clara. I know I failed you, but this isn't about me. It's about our son. Those words hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible to ignore. He seemed smaller in that moment, almost crushed by the weight of his own failures, but I didn't know if I could trust him again. Before I could say anything else, I felt a strange discomfort in my stomach. It wasn't a strong pain, but enough to make me stop and put my hand on my belly. Marcos noticed immediately. Clara, what's wrong? He asked, alarmed. I don't know. Maybe it's just fatigue, I murmured, trying to minimize it, but the discomfort grew. Without hesitation, he approached. You need a doctor. Let's go now. Protesting seemed futile. My strength was running out, and for the first time in a long time, I let him take control of the situation. As he helped me out of the restaurant and led me to the car, I felt a mix of fear and vulnerability that I hadn't felt in years. On the way to the hospital, the silence was interrupted only by the sound of the engine and Marcos's rapid breathing. He seemed genuinely concerned, and for the first time, I wondered if he might actually be trying to change. Deep down, though, one certainty haunted me. My life would never be the same again. The silence in the hospital was oppressive. Only the sound of the machines and the hurried footsteps of the nurses broke the tension. I lay on the gurney, staring at the ceiling as I tried to control my breathing. Every movement felt like it carried the weight of the world. Beside me, Marcos held my hand, his fingers wrapped tightly around mine, and for the first time, I saw something in him that I hadn't recognized before. Genuine vulnerability. Clara, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice firm, but his eyes filled with tears. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words just wouldn't come. It was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, exhaustion, and maybe, just maybe, a little relief that I wasn't alone at that moment. The doctor came in, bringing with him the answer I so desperately needed. Don't worry, Mrs. Clara. The pains seem to be the result of stress. The baby is fine, but you need to rest. Your body is asking for it. Relief washed over me, but it also brought a wave of exhaustion. The doctor walked away, leaving me alone with Marcos. His eyes were fixed on me, and for the first time, he seemed lost, unsure of what to say or do. You have to take care of yourself, he murmured, as if he were trying to convince me and himself. I wanted to say something sharp in response, something that would show that I didn't need him, but I couldn't. Instead, I just closed my eyes and let the tears flow. It wasn't just the relief that the baby was okay, but the weight of carrying everything alone for so long was finally catching up with me. Marcos refused to leave my side that night. He asked for a blanket and settled into the chair next to the gurney. Even when I opened my eyes in the middle of the night, he was there, watching me with an intensity that was both comforting and disconcerting. The next morning, as he helped me out of the hospital, his expression was serious but determined. In the parking lot, he stopped and looked me in the eyes. Clara, you need help. I'm not saying this as the man who wronged you, but as someone who cares about you and the baby. I sighed, too tired to argue. And what do you suggest, Marcos? That I move into your house and pretend everything is fine. He hesitated, but nodded. I'm not asking, I'm offering. My house is big, you'd have your own space. I just want to make sure you and the baby are okay. I was silent for a few moments, considering his words. It wasn't an easy proposition to accept. My instincts screamed at me to keep my distance, to protect the world I had built with so much effort. But at the same time, exhaustion and the need for support began to weigh more heavily. I'll think about it, I finally replied, trying to keep my head up. He nodded, respecting my hesitation, and took me home without insisting. In the following days, Marcos's proposal echoed in my mind. I knew that accepting would mean opening a door to the past, But at the same time, perhaps it was time to face everything head on. After all, the baby needed me to be strong, and deep down, I knew that I couldn't carry everything alone forever. Finally, with a heavy heart, I made my decision. A few days later, I packed my things and moved into Marcos's house. It wasn't a surrender, but a choice for the health of my baby, and perhaps for the chance to find some peace amidst the chaos. Marcos's house was exactly as I remembered it. Large, elegant, and impeccably organized. Every detail seemed carefully planned, from the luxurious furniture to the walls decorated with works of art. But at the same time, that place was lifeless. It was cold, as if it reflected the man he used to be. He helped me set up my things in one of the guest rooms, which he had transformed into a cozy space. He avoided the master bedroom and kept a respectful distance, as if to show that this was my decision and that he would not overstep his bounds. "If you need anything, let me know. I want you to feel comfortable here," he said as he adjusted the bedroom curtain. I just nodded, still unsure of what to expect. There was tension in the air, but also something different, something more human about him. In the early days, Marcos was surprisingly present. He offered to accompany me to doctor's appointments, prepared simple meals, and even read books about pregnancy, trying to understand what I was going through. At times like these, I couldn't help but feel that he was genuinely trying, but the shadow of the past loomed over us. Every gesture he made me wonder, is this real, or is he just trying to make up for what he lost? One night, as I was resting in my room, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. The door was ajar, and I saw Marcos sitting at the table in the living room, his eyes fixed on a stack of papers. He looked tired but focused, as if he were balancing the weight of work with the effort of being present. It was the first time I felt a small glimmer of something that might be admiration. The next morning, he suggested that we assemble the baby's crib together. It was an unexpectedly light moment. Between the confusing instructions and the pieces scattered across the floor, we ended up laughing at ourselves. Who would have thought that assembling a crib would be harder than running a company? He joked, with a smile that seemed more sincere than anything I had ever seen from him. But even in these lighthearted moments, I couldn't completely let my guard down. The fear of being hurt again was still very present. One night, while we were in the living room, he finally broke the silence. "Clara, do you still think I'm not capable of changing?" he asked, his voice low but full of meaning. I looked at him, surprised by his direct question. I took a deep breath before answering. "I don't know, Marcos. What I do know is that you're trying, and that's already more than I expected. But I can't just forget the past." He nodded, as if he'd expected this answer. "I don't want you to forget, Clara. I just want you to see that I'm willing to be different. Not for me, not for us, but for our son." Those words hung in the air, and for the first time, I considered the possibility that he might actually be telling the truth. Maybe, just maybe, he was trying to make amends, not just with me, but with himself. In the days that followed, Marcos continued to show genuine change. He was more present than ever. And little by little, I began to realize that the man standing before me was not exactly the same man who had hurt me in the past. He still had flaws, but he seemed determined to build something new, even if I was still hesitant to fully believe. The baby's birth was approaching, and although I still carried doubts, one thing was clear: our dynamic was changing. And for the first time in a long time, the future seemed less scary. The day arrived before I was completely ready. At the hospital, the delivery room was a mix of controlled chaos and intense emotions. Marcos was at my side, holding my hand with a strength that seemed to say, "I am here. You are not alone." His eyes were teary, and for the first time, I saw a man who was not concerned with the outside world, but only with me and the baby. When our son was finally born, the sound of his cries filled the room, and everything around me seemed to stop. He was perfect, small, fragile, but full of life. The world suddenly seemed smaller, as if nothing else mattered beyond that moment. Marcos held the baby in his arms, his hands trembling, and his gaze fixed on the tiny being. "He's beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Clara." Those simple, sincere words stuck with me. For the first time in years, I saw Marcos without the masks he usually wore, without the facade of a businessman or someone trying to prove something. He was just a father, vulnerable and full of love. In the months that followed, life changed drastically. The tiredness of sleepless nights, the diaper changes, the learning moments, all of it seemed overwhelming, but also transformative. Marcos showed himself to be a present father. He read stories to the baby before bed, volunteered for the most difficult nights, and even learned how to prepare bottles. He was there, not just in person, but in spirit. Little by little, I began to realize that the man before me was different from the one I had left behind. There were still moments of tension, of course. I did not easily forget the pains of the past, and he knew it. But instead of avoiding these conversations, he faced them with patience and humility. One afternoon, while we were at the park with the baby, he looked at me, his face lit by the sun. "Clara, I know I can't change the past. I know I hurt you in ways I never should have. But I want to build something better if you'll let me. Not because I have to, but because I want us to be a family, for real." I stared at him, feeling the sincerity in his words. For a long time, I had carried the scars of what we had been through, using them as a shield against any possibility of getting closer. But in that moment, I realized that maybe it was time to let some barriers down. "I don't know where this is going, Marcos," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to try. Not for us, but for our son." He nodded, a shy smile on his face, but it carried something I hadn't seen in a long time: hope. That night, as we put the baby to bed, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. There was still much to be resolved, many steps to be taken, but for the first time, the path seemed less bleak. Sometimes life forces us to face our past so that we can build a future. And while forgiveness doesn't come easily, it can be the first step towards something new. Marcos and I were still learning how to navigate this new dynamic. But deep down, I knew I was no longer alone. Our son had become the bridge that connected us again. And no matter how uncertain the future seemed, I was willing to give it a chance. This story reminds us that forgiveness, although difficult, can open doors to new beginnings. What about you? What would you do in Clara or Marcos's shoes? Leave your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Thank you for following us, and until next time.